Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week, a very special guest. I'm a big fan of her work, Sharyl Attkisson, who has written a new book called Follow the Science: How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. We're going to red pill you on the pharmaceutical industrial complex, the collusion with big government, and we're even going to touch the third rail and talk about vaccine injury. Check it out. Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Sharyl, it's really cool to get together, and I look forward to this conversation.
Me too, thank you.
Yeah. So before we go down the rabbit hole on your new book, Follow the Science, I'd like to talk to you about this Amish study that you've debunked, because it could be sort of a microcosm of the broader problem of the corruption of science and government agencies and universities and everything else. Your contention was that the Amish community, which didn't do all of the authoritarian protocols during lockdowns, fared just as well, if not better. And you've been pouring through this study. Tell the story.
Well, I was not the only one that covered the fact that the Amish, ignoring basically all of the protocols of the government as they do, because that's a religious belief, they don't vaccinate, they don't go to the hospital, they weren't testing for COVID, they weren't isolating. And it became clear that they, I guess, were the first community to get what some people would call herd immunity. They allowed COVID to race through. They did not get it, they got it, but it came through rather quickly, the first wave. And if you look at over time, even after subsequent waves, the evidence shows that arguably fewer people died, and definitely no more people died than in the population that actually did all kinds of measures. So it clearly looked as though the Amish approach was superior, something the government will never want to admit or study, but for not having shut down their economy and education and used experimental vaccines and spent so much money on medicine, they fared quite well comparatively. So a study comes out pretty soon after that, funded by the government, that looks to me like it's attempting to state the opposite. If you look at the title, it makes it sound like these closed religious communities have all these excess deaths, and we really need to attack the notion that their crazy religious beliefs could be killing them. But I knew it wasn't true, and as I dug into the study and read the data, I thought that the study did not accurately represent what they found. I thought the study sample was improper, and there were a lot of problems. So I began, as I've done before, questioning the study with the scientific journal and the scientists in a long process, because they certainly don't want to admit or acknowledge that there are issues. I also tried to obtain the documents that we own, because we funded the study, that would show who's communicating with them, who decided to have the study get done, what were the conversations like, but they won't turn any of that over. But after a year of presenting my case, actually over a year, finally, in the past week or so, I got a letter from the journal that said we have issued multiple corrections to this study that had been peer-reviewed and published. Not good enough, because it leaves the wrong misimpression in my view, but I'm still glad that I was able to force some corrections and at least, have that in the record, the acknowledgement that science too often today is used, in my view, as propaganda to further narratives rather than to get at the truth. And one more little thing, sorry for going on so long, but one of the things they did that suggested to me this was a work of propaganda, in their sample, they blended the Amish population with the Mennonite population, which they knew would skew the sample improperly, because the Mennonite population is generally compliant with CDC guidelines. The Amish is not. Why did they blend that population? That was not supposed to be done according to the grant proposal. Number two, I learned they excluded the largest Amish population in the U.S., where I had done my story, Lancaster, PA. Why are you excluding your best data point from the study that claims to be definitive on this? So those were two things that were glaring to me when I initially looked at the study.
It's fascinating to me, and I love your I think it's your first chapter going down the rabbit hole, because since the beginning of the lockdowns, I've gone down this rabbit hole and realizing that science, which I think rightly should be celebrated as the process of innovation that makes us live longer and healthier and happier and more prosperous, and all the things that scientific innovation does, that the scientific process itself, the scientific community, the university system, certainly pharmaceutical companies, that this entire public health apparatus has been captured and corrupted in a fundamental way. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you about this, because you've been digging deeper than I have. But one of those examples that was so shocking and revealing to me, and I know you've covered this, is the so-called proximal origins paper published in one of the most respected science journals, that was essentially 100% propaganda, knowingly telling a falsehood, as we've learned after the fact. But this appears to be more systemic than I would have ever imagined before that discovery.
This is an example of how the scientific journals, by the admission of some of the editors-in-chief, have become nothing more in some cases than propaganda for the vaccine and pharmaceutical industry, whereby scientists with vested interests or who work for companies ghostwrite articles or consult on them behind the scenes, get them published when they are no more than advertising or, as I said, propaganda, and then cloak their roles in such a way that doctors and the public never know. This is held out as sort of independent research when that's hardly what it is. So this is not uncommon, sadly, in research. In this case, the one you're referring to, as those who were implicated in the COVID virus getting loose and being man-manipulated, the very people who are implicated in that research and in funding it, including Dr. Fauci, we now know conspired behind the scenes to have articles published and then hold them out as definitive word that this couldn't have come from the lab, without disclosing their own role in this work of propaganda. So they would help get these articles published in the journals, and then they would later, these public officials, hold out to the media, look at this independent research that concludes that's a conspiracy theory, and not disclose their own conflict of interest.
Yeah, and in the case of the Amish study that you just talked about, this is actually government-funded propaganda. It's not always directly government-funded, but again, as captured institutions, they still know where the money flows from.
That's right. Another good example, and I'm still trying to get this study corrected or retracted, there was a very small study of neurological events in a hospital after COVID vaccine that sought to prove that these neurological brain events that happen in people after a vaccine are not related to the vaccine. And they concluded, based on a very small study on a very short period of time, knowing that many adverse events happen months or years later, they studied a very short period of time and concluded that all of the patients had pre-existing factors. So let's say they had a heart problem after the vaccine. They were able to say, well, that patient, the grandfather had a heart attack, so therefore it couldn't have been the vaccine. Well, there's a clear fallacy of this scientifically. Everybody knows that medicine can exacerbate someone with a pre-existing condition. So how did they rule out that the vaccines were a cofactor, a contributing factor to the heart attack or the heart problem? They didn't. They simply declared that because a different thing could be blamed, that it exonerated the vaccine, which is not true. That's not how it works. So I'm also questioning that. I also wanted the communications and the data for that study, government funded. And the outrage there is the government funds the study, but through, in this case, a private university, Columbia, who claims we're not subject to Freedom of Information Act. So therefore, we're allowing the government basically to legally launder our taxpayer money to private institutions to put out narratives and propaganda and then keep secret all the terms under which they had this material published.
It reminds me in a way of the Stanford Internet Observatory, which apparently has been shut down, but this is the supposedly academic institution that essentially was being funded by government to do their censorship for them. They went after our mutual friend Jay Bhattacharya and other COVID dissidents, but it creates this patina of independence and academic expertise, but it's just a way of sort of laundering government speech policing.
I mean, this is rampant in the information industry, scientific and otherwise, where third parties or neutral sounding nonprofits or fact checkers that claim to be independent are actually funded by government/industry in a way that's often invisible to us and designed to be a resource for the press or a resource for doctors who don't scratch beneath the surface and understand they're getting nothing more than advertising, basically.
So let's dig into the book, and specifically, it's fascinating that your journey basically starts on 9/11, and I don't know if you've gone down a different rabbit hole than me, but I'm currently doing a series called The Cover-Up for BlazeTV, and Jay Bhattacharya was in many ways the inspiration for this, because he is the one that pointed out to me the explosion in government-funded research, the very explosion in funding that gave Fauci his sort of extremely powerful, unique perch controlling the flow of government funding. And it was after 9/11, and it was in the name of bioterrorism research. But you were already noticing this with the smallpox vaccine. I had forgotten that story altogether. Tell that story and talk a little bit about your journey that's led you to this, what is really a substantial part of all of your investigative journalism.
I think I'm like a lot of people, whereas around the 2000 time period, I wasn't covering medical issues initially until CBS News assigned me to do so. I still naively thought that medicine was pretty pure, that scientific studies were to be believed, that doctors have the best information, public health agencies wouldn't lie to us about anything, and all that changed. I mean, the book basically selects stories among so many to help people understand how I got where I am today. I didn't start in the middle as a skeptic, and my dad's a brother, my doctor's a brother. But the first big story along these lines was the start up of the smallpox vaccine program after 9/11 to get people inoculated, because the thought would be that terrorists could use smallpox as a bioweapon. And as I learned for the first time, these vaccines can have side effects. As silly as it sounds, I didn't think vaccines had side effects. I just always thought all vaccines are good, and I didn't understand the biological mechanisms. But immediately, the experts who favored the program were cautioning that the smallpox vaccine is problematic in some respects, more so than even other vaccines, so we want to be very careful. They start an experimental program with first responders and military initially, and there are a handful of deaths kind of right away, including from myocarditis. There were blood clots, deep vein thrombosis. Does all that sound familiar, compared to what we're hearing today about COVID vaccine effects? And then there was a key death, that of a colleague of mine at NBC, David Bloom, who died of a blood clot, deep vein thrombosis, when he was embedded with the troops. And I guess that only didn't drive home the idea, not only drove home the idea that vaccines could cause these side effects, but the cover-up aspect. Because I've been researching and talking to the experts about smallpox vaccine, and I knew about some of the side effects. I had just read about deep vein thrombosis being something that can be caused. But David dies, a young, healthy guy, and nobody asked the question. I found out through my sources he had had the smallpox vaccine recently and the anthrax shot as well, which can exacerbate a problem, and maybe had pre-existing conditions, which could also be problematic. And I also learned that the government did not properly report his death as a possible adverse event, which was required. Anybody who suffered from some kind of problem after this experimental vaccine at the time was required to be reported to a database, and he wasn't. So as a result of my reporting, that happened. But I guess it also sent me down the rabbit hole, as I say, in understanding that people would cover up something like that, and why would it be, and how these vaccines were not necessarily all good with no bad.
So the context for this, and I just interviewed for my series a guy named Dr. Richard Ebright, and nobody knew this perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, but he has been the arch nemesis of Anthony Fauci going all the way back to 2001, 2002, 2003, criticizing gain of function research and this radical experimentation and weaponizing of viruses that Anthony Fauci was a big advocate of. And when you start to think about it in that context, and particularly today in the context of the way that the government is so entwined with big pharma, I'm trying to figure out what is actually going on. I'm an economist by training, and we have this phrase called regulatory capture, where corporate industries basically write the rules of the supposed people that are regulating them, overseeing them, as a way to create a cartel and keep out new entrants and to control that process. But everything you describe in your book is far more complicated than that. And I haven't been able to come up with a word for it. Is it political capture? Is big pharma in charge of the government public health agencies? Are the government public health agencies telling big pharma what to do, or is it just one big thing? What's your take on that?
It's more the agencies are doing the bidding of big pharma, and they've been convinced to be in that relationship over a period of decades where it's been allowed to happen and take place. Some of it is ideological. They're true believers in the narratives, but a lot of it, I think, is ultimately driven by propaganda that was created to protect financial interests of the companies and has just become embedded into the fabric of our information landscape. And the best way to think of it, I don't have a name for it either, but I feel like there is a pharmaceutical industrial complex that permeates media, as we well know, through advertising dollars and influence, and politics, as I think we well know, through contributions to both political parties at the highest levels and lobbyists that numbered recently 3 for every member of Congress on Capitol Hill. But also the one that I think is very important and less discussed is the influence on the medical establishment. And that by that, I mean people are unaware of the pharmaceutical industry's influence on the curriculum in medical school, including a major reference book doctors refer to in school that was written by a drug company. That's a fascinating development, including the continuing medical education classes that doctors have to take to maintain their licenses, which are frequently taught by vaccine and pharmaceutical interests, who, by the way, don't always disclose that's who they work for. They give their academic titles, but don't, unless you look at the fine print, say that they work for a host or an A to Z, alphabet of vaccine makers and pharmaceutical companies.
Regular viewers of Kibbe on Liberty already know how obsessed I have been with the pandemic industrial complex and all of the stupid, authoritarian, and downright evil things that the government did to us during COVID-19. Well, I'm proud to announce a new investigative series that looks to get to the bottom of all of that. It's called The Cover-Up, and I'm producing it in cooperation with BlazeTV. The only place you're going to see this is BlazeTV, so go to FauciCoverup.com/Kibbe and use the code FauciLied for $30 off your annual subscription. Do it now. The truth is out there. So it's definitely financial capture in that telling of the story, and I assume, like every other government agency, the regulators either come from the pharmaceutical industry when they go into public service, and then they go back out through the revolving door. But you probably can't do the work unless you're feeding at that trough.
I think you can't get to a high level or a high position unless you're someone who's playing the game. I'll give an example. The current head of the FDA is mentioned early in my book from an examination of an allegedly unethical study that he defended on premature babies years ago. Shockingly defended this study that even the government's inside watchdog group said was unethical in terms of informed consent. Watchdog said it resulted in some of the premature babies dying. The parents weren't told any of this stuff. And he not only defended that, but went on, he's head of the FDA today. So you see the same names pop up. You would think that that would be an exclusionary thing. Even if you wanted to take the high road and say he didn't mean any harm, or he was part of defending a study that maybe there's good reasons at the time to defend it and he didn't know. How does someone like that get to be head of the FDA down the road? But there are a lot of names that keep coming up over and over again who stay in this pipeline. I think they're being rewarded for playing the game the way that, the money interests want it to be played.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go with your phrase, the pharmaceutical industrial complex, because there is actually a militarization about it, particularly in the context of the vaccine solution to COVID. And just thinking about it as a business person, wouldn't it be cool if you could create a product that the government would then mandate at force of losing your job that everyone take, and then booster after booster, and then young children as young as 6 months. I'm not saying it's a virtuous business, but it sure sounds profitable.
And I'm not saying that they conspire inside the industry overtly to create these other markets, but what if you have a mandated vaccine that ends up causing chronic health disorders down the road that you then can also treat with another arm of your company? That's certainly nothing that they would want to turn away.
It's like a vicious cycle, perhaps. I want to talk about the way that they control the narrative, because again, this was something that I was shocked to learn about, the dominance of the pharmaceutical industry when it came to advertising dollars flowing into tech companies, flowing into corporate media. But in hindsight, it makes perfect sense that everybody was in the tank, because, again, the cash flow almost demands that you obey your advertising masters when it comes to this. And you've documented this fairly thoroughly in the book.
And there are the advertising interests are overt. Everybody gets that now. But there are so many sneaky ways that finances creep into it that nobody considers. There's a whole chapter that traces the same handful of interests promoting the same narratives over and over again through funding initiatives like the Stanford one, and third-party nonprofits and independent sounding groups and organizations, and groups that claim to be, resources for the press. They can do these fake fact checks. They can tell you that all this information that's true really isn't true. These are funded behind closed doors by these same interests. Nonprofits with names that sound like they do the opposite, like Every Child by Two, which has changed its name now, but it sounds like it's this great independent group that just wants to get children vaccinated. Turns out, as I learned, when their behavior was strange, it didn't seem to me to be in the best interest of children. They didn't want to even hear about vaccine side effects. And I'm thinking, why does this, group that's interested in the health of babies why are they acting this way about safety information? Every time I go down the road, there's a money tie. And that was a group started by a drug company. The treasurer, I believe, for GlaxoSmithKline was listed as the starting entity. And it's basically a wholly owned subsidiary of the vaccine industry that tries to, in my opinion, trick people into thinking they're an independent resource about babies and vaccines, but has that same language that the government and all these other sites and nonprofits and hospitals have, trying to debunk things that haven't been debunked. One great example, I hope you don't mind me you didn't ask the question this way, but something people can watch out for when a site like CDC or Children's Hospital of Philadelphia or Mayo Clinic or any of them say vaccines are safe and effective. What a crazy statement that is. That makes no sense. That's like saying cars are safe. Cars are safe when operated a certain way. Certain cars are safe, certain cars are recalled. Same with medicine. Some people can't take penicillin, but penicillin is great for people that can take it. Vaccines are individuals. Certainly vaccines that have been pulled off the market for safety reasons aren't safe and effective because everybody's acknowledged they're not. Some vaccines are contraindicated for some people on the label. Those aren't safe and effective for those people. So the blanket statement that we're trying, this illogical statement, is sort of like follow the science. It makes no sense when scrutinized. And when you see all these mainstream establishment medical authorities saying that, you have to wonder, wow, Like, who is not co-opted?
Yeah. And that mantra, it sounds like, certainly precedes COVID vaccines.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, the COVID vaccine issue, I think the one positive thing that came out of it is so many people saw what happened with their very eyes that was contrary to what the government was saying. The government put out so much misinformation, it got people thinking. And I think that's the broader theme of Follow the Science, that how does this apply to the fact that all of us know for the past couple of decades, America's been getting sicker and sicker with chronic and new diseases, never unheard of or not or unheard of in certain populations. And yet we've never spent more money on hospitals and pills and treatments and doctors. And the medical establishment is either pretending not to notice or doesn't notice at all, but for to throw medicine our way, like nobody's looking to see why are we having this explosion and all of these crazy things? What's in common? What can we do? I think that's the bigger picture angle that people are starting to finally look at and recognize now.
It's a political movement now. It's the Maha movement. It, in large part, is starting to ask these questions. Obviously, inspired by RFK Jr. and his work, which has been thoroughly demonized. And at this point, the more they demonize him, the more I'm sort of intrigued to go down some of the research rabbit holes that he suggests, because I'm now realizing that this entire system is rigged against actual science.
So that's a piece of advice I like to give. When you hear the same narrative and even the same verbiage used throughout the media and social media and mainstream, that's not organic, because there are thousands of news organizations. The idea that they would all come up with the same stories and debunk the same thing and use the same words and consult the same experts, that's an organized effort. So when you hear that, based on our recent experience, your first thought should be like yours is, maybe I should go down that road. When they say don't believe something, there may be a grain of truth to that or more. And your first question should also be, who wants me to believe this other thing and why? Some powerful interest has gotten everybody on board with this narrative. So who could that be that doesn't want me to explore this, and maybe I ought to explore that very thing?
Yeah. So I'm a libertarian, and I think about this in the context of some of the perhaps naive faith that we libertarians had in the scientific process and medical innovation. And I think that's the reason why some libertarians got it so fundamentally wrong at the beginning of the pandemic, when they were first in line to say, trust the science, because we sort of naively believed that the scientific process was this open-ended discovery process where you had, competing scientists arguing and competing innovations being tested and competed with, and that kind of thing. And then you realize that it's not only a cartel, but, like, again, going back to this entwined relationship between government and the pharmaceutical industry. I had no idea that government scientists could own intellectual property in pharmaceutical patented products.
I don't know of any other arrangement in private industry that's quite like this or that's allowed, but someone decided to make it where National Institutes of Health scientists who work on our dime can invent some product, and then the product can be sold, or rights to it, to a private pharmaceutical company, and then the scientists receive royalties from it, which incentivizes, further than it already is, the invention of products and the success of products that will make money but not necessarily solve our consequential health problems. It directs funding in a certain way that's conflicted, and that a lot of people shouldn't think should be allowed. And in fact, when members of Congress try to get at the stats, members of Congress and watchdog groups, well, how much money are certain scientists getting from what companies? The government has the nerve to tell us we can't have the information. That's our information. They're working for us. It's our money. And then we're consistently told we can't have that. That's proprietary, because they see their partners and customers and stakeholders not in internal documents, not as us. It's the pharmaceutical industry that they refer to as the people that they serve.
Yeah, this happened when Senator Rand Paul, sort of over period of conversations that became quite confrontational with Anthony Fauci, the more evasive he became, the harder Rand started hitting back. But it was still quite shocking to me to see a government bureaucrat answering to a oversight committee, a standing senator whose constitutional job it is to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent in a rational and transparent way, to actually have Fauci call him a liar. And then when Rand asks, well, do you make money? And Fauci says, I don't have to tell you that. Shocking stuff.
I mean, this is the story of our federal agencies, isn't it, these days, that they don't think they work for us. They treat us like we work for them. They seem to have no understanding that they're accountable and derive their power from the people. They act like there's some sort of entities that lord over us, and that includes our public health agencies, which I think is the worst of all possible worlds, to have them thinking that they're to tell us what to do and keep information from us that they don't want us to have, even when true, because they don't want us to have that information to make up our own minds with, and to put out disinformation and then not be held accountable for any of it. There's a list in the book of maybe a dozen statements, there's been so many, that CDC put out statistic statements that are completely false, some of which they never corrected, and certainly never explained any of them, all of which happen to exaggerate the appearance of the toll COVID takes in healthy kids, or exaggerated the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine in kids at a time when CDC was starting to promote the vaccine for children. It's pretty shocking.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love Liberty and look cool.
So I've had Thomas Massie on this show probably more than anybody else, and we ended up, because he was so lonely in Washington in the early days of questioning the government's response to COVID, we ended up sort of living that live throughout this process because we were such heretics asking these questions. But the piece you did with Thomas Massie, where he records CDC officials basically acknowledging that they were lying, it's pretty amazing stuff. Did anyone ever get fired or held accountable for that?
No. I mean, again, this shows you the agencies know they're untouchable because those doing the oversight, not the individual members necessarily, but the party officials, are never going to do anything, that holds them accountable because of the money they receive. But to have, I mean, this was just, in terms of proof, a beautiful thing, because I usually don't use the word lie. Even when people say, why don't you say in a story that so-and-so lied? And I said, well, that requires you to get in the mind of somebody, and that's up to you to decide. You probably can draw your own conclusion, but I can't say for sure I know it was in a person's mind. But there are a few times that you do know. And in the case of these conversations Massie recorded, he got them. This is another subplot. The federal agencies, when you ask these logical questions, they twist you into a pretzel, pretending they don't understand what you're talking about, making you start over, promising to address it, and then they don't. So his conversations went on for probably hours, and I excerpted them. But it's just an exercise in just really disgust and understanding how they're spinning like you're stupid, but just they're delaying and obfuscating. And then eventually they do acknowledge that he was right, that they put false information out in the public domain that could be injurious to people in the context that he's discussing. And this information was signed off by maybe a dozen vaccine experts on the advisory committee for vaccines. And the information that claimed something that wasn't true was completely fabricated. So the question is, who fabricated it? Who wrote this article that they all signed off on? Aren't they all mortified that they signed off on false material? And don't they want to know who's behind it? Shouldn't we all know? And after admitting this to him, finally acknowledging it, they went out within a couple of days in a webinar that's recorded, and after acknowledging that it wasn't true, told doctors the opposite again, made the same claim that they had just admitted to Massie wasn't true. There you have it. You have the proof that they know they're putting out false information. They're continuing to do it, and it's on purpose.
And they ran into the wrong guy, because what they can usually do is just hit you with sciencey sounding bullshit until you don't know exactly what's going on. And this is probably true with Rand Paul as well. They had done their research, and they understand science well enough to know that what they're hearing is not science, it's bullshit.
That's right. And sometimes, like you say, they try to double talk you, but it doesn't take necessarily an MIT engineer like Thomas Massey to call the BS. I've gotten, studies corrected because I'm a layperson that just applies my common sense. And when they try to double talk you and say you don't understand because there's this and that, I found myself able to say that makes no sense, but X. So a lot of times I feel like they're making the argument, don't believe what you're reading or thinking. There's really far more to it. I mean, one great example I think of that is, we now know, I think multiple studies indicate, the more vaccinated with COVID vaccine that a society was, the more cases of COVID they got. And I noticed very early on, as the vaccine became ubiquitous, COVID grew worse than ever, the number of cases. So clearly, it's somehow exacerbating COVID. And we now know that happened in Israel, and then other countries that were heavily vaccinated. And in places that were not, they did not have the same problem. But when that was starting to be exposed in studies, people were saying things like, you don't understand. The reason more people are dying that have been vaccinated is because more people have been vaccinated. So of course more people are in the dying population with vaccination. And as I point out in the book, that argument makes sense if the vaccine doesn't work. If you're acknowledging the vaccine has no impact, and then those who get it die just as much as those who don't get it, that makes sense. But if you're trying to claim the vaccine does anything, the trajectory should be the opposite. As more and more people get vaccinated, the number of COVID cases should have gone in the opposite direction. Nothing more complicated than that. But there was so much propaganda and even social media trying to convince us, don't believe what you're seeing with your very eyes. There's way more to it than that. Yeah.
So I want to maybe go back and try to figure out how we got here, because I think you would agree that things are worse than they used to be. And and this is just anecdotal, but I look at public health, and I look at chronic disease and the overprescription of drugs like Adderall, and I'm like, something's off the rails here. And as an economist, I'm trying to think about, like, how did it get so corrupted? One of the things that I point to is the patent system, and particularly the manipulation of the patent system in the context of what happened in this case. They came up with a patent protected product, and simultaneously were demonizing therapeutics that were not patent protected so that they could get emergency use authorization. Is the patent system part of the problem, or what do you think created this sort of cancerous situation?
That's an interesting point you raise. I don't know anything about it, but I think that's a really good, relevant data point to look at. Related to that, the notion that cheap, already available drugs could be repurposed for this use, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, but were demonized, was another concerted campaign that I trace in the book, versus the medicines, as you say, where there was a lot of profit to be made from. But I think there's a second component that people don't know about. I don't know if you call it a rule, it's not really a law, but you can't in this country put out an experimental vaccine, because all vaccines have risks. It's not your first resort, unless there is no existing effective medicine. So if hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin had proven in studies and in usage to be effective at preventing or treating COVID, as hydroxychloroquine was proving if you give it very quickly early on, then that potentially disrupts the whole notion that you've got this vaccine in the pipeline, these vaccines that are multi-billion-dollar vaccines. You can't do that. So I feel like in retrospect, there were definitely vested interests that did not want anything else before the vaccines came out to look like they could be effective in preventing or treating COVID early on, like these drugs might have done.
I have limited knowledge of this myself. I just see this process where big pharma spends all of their research looking for patentable solutions to problems that may or may not be effective, but if they can find a large enough population, and then if they could actually get the government to either cover it through Medicaid and Medicare, or in the case of the COVID shot, just mandated outright, that doesn't work if they discover that vitamin C is the solution, or vitamin D. So it's not. I'm not necessarily attacking patents per se, but the manipulation of it and the extension of patents where they don't let generic drugs pick up the innovation over some period of time. So that maybe that's part of it, but it seems more structural than that. What's your theory on how things got so out of whack?
It's been a long and slow process, and I think it's a story of institutions failing to construct firewalls early on that they should have constructed. By that, I mean the media. It would have been easy when we approved in this country pharmaceutical drugs to be advertised on TV, not allowed hardly anywhere else in the world, but our pharmaceutical industry lobbied side by side with broadcast networks on Capitol Hill to allow this multi-billion-dollar relationship. And as soon as that relationship was forged, there should have been a firewall put up between the news divisions and maybe other divisions of the corporations and the money-making side. But there weren't these firewalls. They didn't want the firewalls. And so therefore, the pharmaceutical industry came to easily begin to influence the news divisions and what was reported. No firewalls exist, on Capitol Hill between taking money from the pharmaceutical industry and then serving on a committee that then would hold oversight hearings, if they had them anymore, on the pharmaceutical industry. There used to be that sort of thing. The Energy and Commerce Committee used to hold all kinds of hearings on drug safety, and even back in the day on vaccines. You will never have a hearing allowed like that today, because the committee members are given lists by their party leaders of who to raise money from in order to get those plum positions on the committee, and they have to call the pharmaceutical industry and raise money from them. So they're basically taking money to not hold hearings and not do oversight and to allow the industry to write their laws. So no firewall there. And then a very serious ethical lack of firewalls in the medical establishment, between the medical associations that tell doctors what to do, between the medical schools that teach doctors. There should be firewalls that keep out the pharmaceutical influence. And at every step, I think there's been a failure in, keep dividing a bright line between that kind of influence and the people that should be watching out for our best interests.
As a reporter, when did you notice that shift? Because I am, in fact, old enough to remember investigative reporting that was calling out the damage done by bad medicines. But yeah, it disappeared at some point.
It was all the rage in the early 2000s. New York Times was doing it. I was doing it. CBS, LA Times was doing it. Washington Post, the other networks. We were competing for these stories. There were few stories more impactful to the public than potential dangers of prescription drugs, including vaccines. And we were all covering them. But this was when the drug advertising was becoming ubiquitous and very profitable. And pretty quickly, the drug industry, the pharmaceutical industry, I think they were in crisis mode. Drugs were being pulled off the market as a result of our coverage at congressional hearings. Whistleblowers were coming forward. It was proving to be quite damaging. People were talking about reforming the FDA. And it turned around in a pretty short period of time as influence in the early 2000s came to bear on the news divisions, and that the advertising money got to be stronger and stronger. So that's when I noticed, because it went from the company assigning me to cover these stories and thinking they were terrific to feeling pressure from other corners of the corporate structure, and then ultimately from within the newsroom itself, to not do the very same stories that were extremely popular with the viewing public.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty, and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with BlazeTV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it.
I don't know if this is true, but I want to posit it to you as a potential place to do research. You're talking about a period, again, right after 9/11, right after the fundamental transformation of NIAID, which is where Anthony Fauci was. And Dr. Ebright tells me that, at the time, the shift away from traditional scientific research and looking for solutions in universities of problems, it went from that to this sweeping bioterrorism research agenda, all sort of centralized and infusing of billions of new dollars that were being sent to scientists and universities. I wonder if these things are related because clearly there's a corrupting force of all that money and centralization coming from Fauci and his colleagues at the same time.
Has to be. And in a broader sense, so I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, which is a great area to look into. Researchers know at the academic institutions and elsewhere, and they've told me, if they don't come up with a question for a study that the pharmaceutical industry / government want answered, they won't get funding. So they may think there's an amazing critical problem in our health that needs to be addressed, that are really obvious problems. But they know that if they don't frame their study proposal in a way that answers a question that the government and pharmaceutical industry want answered, usually that's going to make a profit for somebody based on a product, they're not going to get funding. So they either contort their research in such a way to try to answer some question that's favorable to a product, or they go in a different direction because they don't think in general that they're likely to get funded if they're attacking some of our, again, consequential health issues that nobody seems to be doing anything about.
So let's embrace the third rail. I know you've done this already, and I would love your the wisdom of your research on this. Vaccine damage, and I could observe, and again, I hadn't thought about this until after I saw the corruptions that came from the COVID vaccine. But it appears to me as having taken a casual look at this, that the number of vaccines that we're giving children and the rise in autism, these appear to be objective facts. And I wouldn't be capable of comparing one to the other, but I know that until recently, we weren't even allowed to ask this question in polite company. You've dug into this.
Well, let's start by saying that as autism has exploded off the scales, I can think of a few other things that have been just appeared on the stage seemingly from nowhere and hasn't been treated like a public health emergency of any kind with no action plan. And the government's and public health complex simply saying, we don't know what causes it, but it can't be the one thing that's implicated, which is, plenty of studies, court documents, court cases the government has tried to have sealed. All of those implicate vaccines as a contributing factor in the autism epidemic that we have today. I think research would indicate it's a complex equation, but that's certainly impacted. And even the government scientists who've tried to say this is not the case have said in public documents and testimony in court cases and so on that there is a link. Even the head of CDC immunization, they always try to say this has all been debunked, probably did an interview with me, maybe he wishes he hadn't done in retrospect, but I knew how to ask the questions the right way. And he acknowledged to me that that's an open question and that, yes, there had been one really high-profile case I brought up where the government admitted vaccines triggered autism in a child, that they then paid a huge settlement to the government on behalf of the vaccine industry. And then they tried to have the case sealed so no parent would ever know about it, and went out publicly and said that there was no such case, that this was all debunked. There's a long litany of evidence and documents contrary to what we've all been told. And as a journalist, that was so intriguing to me because I thought it was crazy talk because I didn't understand the biological mechanism because I trusted our health system. My own daughter fully vaccinated, never questioned anything about it. And when I started to see the evidence, like a lot of people who go down this rabbit hole, I was stunned. I was stunned by the dishonesty in what we are told on a daily basis by our most trusted health officials and medical establishment and the media. So that's been a fascinating journey.
And to go back to your earlier point, it sure sounds like propaganda when they make a blanket statement like vaccines are safe and effective.
That's right.
Meaningless in its substance. And I saw you argue this somewhere, maybe I read it in the book, but to ask the question when there's smoke, maybe there's fire, is in fact ultimately not anti-vax but pro-vax, because if you want parents to have confidence that they're making the right decisions for their children, they want to know that people at the highest levels are asking the toughest questions possible and holding these to the highest standard.
Look, I saw an email exchange from a long time ago, maybe in the late 90s, between a public health service person and someone else in the federal government addressing, at the time, autism is many different forms of brain and other kinds of injury that we group under one heading. And vaccines can cause a lot of different side effects. But at the time, they were concerned about what was being revealed about a preservative that's still in most flu shots called thimerosal, that's mercury-based. A lot of parents are worried about this. Toxic for some children who can't shed it, according to studies, who can't pee and poop it out normally. So they're talking about this concern, and one of the officials says to the other, we can't really, I'm paraphrasing, come clean publicly about this because they'll wonder why we didn't do the 8th grade math to add up the cumulative mercury load we were giving kids when we tripled the vaccine schedule, talking about the late 90s. It's way bigger even now. And the other person, a woman, if my memory serves me correct, was arguing we have to come clean with the public because if we don't, they know something's up and it's going to destroy confidence in the vaccine program. Because he was saying, and this is the argument as a journalist, they tell you behind the scenes, you don't want to report this stuff, it'll kill babies because people will get hesitant and they won't vaccinate and diseases will come back. And that sounds very compelling until you sort of analyze it logically. Like, you want me to hide the truth because you don't want to deal with the fallout? Like, that's not really my job. And she was basically saying that. She said, there may be a momentary blip in vaccination if we admit the truth, but it won't last long and it will build confidence because people will say, okay, they told us they found a problem. They're fixing it. They're going to adjust for it. And now we can trust that they're watching out for our better health. But she said, if we don't do that, that's going to really create a problem for confidence in the vaccine program. And that's where they are today. Every time the government or people in the media argue, the anti-vaxxers have destroyed confidence in vaccines, my thought is always, you did that. Like, you're the one who's destroyed confidence by your misstatements and your misinformation. You're making people not trust anything you do now because you're not coming clean about things that they're sure you're not telling the truth about.
So it's a bit of a dilemma for me because you're giving me all sorts of red pills to swallow here about how big pharma operates, but I've always been an advocate of right to try, and I do think that patients with potentially deadly diseases should have the right to try new innovations out there that haven't necessarily gone through all of the FDA protocols. But I also believe in the right to know about what actually is going on, and I believe in the right to refuse experimental vaccines. And I don't think these are contradictions, but I wonder how you would parse the question of medical innovation and medical freedom and how let's just talk about parents again one more time. Like, how do they make these decisions when everything is so corrupted?
It boils down to sort of like two parts answer. Informed consent is the key. If you want to try an experimental medicine that may save your life that's got risks, as long as someone tells you that, that's your choice in my view. You have the right to do that. Nothing wrong with that. If you want to give your child a vaccine and you have the full information, you should do that. The problem is they're not giving us the full information. My favorite example is when my daughter was little, doctor says, do you want to give her sugar water for the polio vaccine, the oral version they called sugar water at the time, or a shot? Because they had two kinds. And of course, as a mom, you're like, I want my daughter to have sugar water. Come to find out, many years later, as I'm covering these scandals, the sugar water has a slight chance of giving your kid polio, whereas the injectable version has no chance of giving your kid polio. I am so mad that my doctor didn't put it that way to me, because I would never have opted to give my child an even infinitesimal chance of getting polio. So the problem is in informed consent. I think that's the issue. And something that should scare all of us is there's stories in the book about lack of informed consent where researchers have not met this standard in telling study subjects, for example, what the risks of a study were to their premature babies who died in the study, things like that. And instead of correcting them, the researchers have defended this lack of informed consent, saying, in essence, if we tell everybody what the side effects are or what the downside of this research is, we won't get enough people to be in the study, and then we can't do good research for the greater good. And my answer is, you don't have the right to make that decision, that you're not going to tell me because you're looking out for what you say is the greater good or your product that you're trying to develop. In recent months, the FDA passed a rule. The dreams came true of these researchers defending that informed consent is just a little too strict. And now researchers do not have to tell you about the risks of a study if they decide the risks are minimal. Problem with that is they've been wrong about that. They've been misleading on that in the past, but now they don't have to tell you all the risks of the study if they decide the risks are minimal. My question is, if the risks are minimal, why aren't they telling you? What were they scared of? So that should scare everybody. That upends research rules on informed consent that were put in place decades ago after the horrible Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where Black men were experimented on and had syphilis and were continued to allow to suffer even after there was a treatment for it, and were not told this is what was happening to them. So these rules went into place to avoid these kind of ethical conflicts. And now, this past year, to have the FDA lift all that and say, hey, that's being a little too picky that we have to tell people all about the risks. I think that's a big story.
Yeah, it's a monstrous attitude, and Tuskegee is a great example of how I think probably the government corrupted these medical ethics issues, which certainly at some point were not so pliable to fit the interests of big pharma. So let's wrap up on this. No pressure at all, but given what you know, how do we fix this? Like, how would we get to informed consent and transparency? My libertarian instincts again tell me, like, I want a separation of government and science, because all of these agencies are now captured by big pharma. But what is your solution?
I've thought it out, and I don't see an easy answer, because this is something that needed to be worked on decades ago. Like, we're far too deep to extricate the influence with some simple, regulatory changes or even a couple of laws. So sadly, I don't have a big answer, but my little answer, the thing that people can do for themselves, is be better consumers of better information on your health. And that can make a big difference, like holding your own doctor's feet to the fire, or seeing only the doctors that are doing the kind of research and doctoring that you want to have done, that isn't just benefiting big pharma or going, and there are plenty of doctors like that if you look for them. And if you start rewarding that kind of doctoring, maybe we're going to carve out the old form that tends to, in some cases, go in one direction and not look at root causes and let us get sicker and sicker. Sadly, the media's job, I always thought, was to bring different information, views, scientific data forward so that people can have information to make up their minds. We're not doing a good job of that for the reasons we've discussed. So people have to put a little more of their own personal effort into it. But there are great ways to start to be a critical thinker in terms of identifying good sources, whether it's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya or looking at alternate medical groups that have formed in the wake of the COVID debacle that are doing independent research and protocols like FLCCC. I've suggested a bunch of them at the end of the book. You can, when you start getting in the right mindset, become a better thinker about what might be real and what might be propaganda. It's possible to do so. So I think That's the best information. That's the best advice that I can recommend, is on a personal scale, what you can do to try to improve the health for you and your family.
Yeah, it feels like we're in the middle of a paradigm shift on everything, but certainly the authorities, like your doctor in the white coat, but certainly I always pick on Walter Cronkite when he used to tell us that's the way it is. And we all mindlessly just did whatever our doctor told us to do. As uncomfortable as it is, I suspect now that we know that they're literally just reading talking points that were sent down the chain of command, that we have to take that responsibility for ourselves. And as big as that burden is, it's liberating as well, that we could actually have to go figure it out for ourselves.
Yep. And keep looking for those doctors. I can't tell you enough how many people have been given the cold shoulder at their doctors when they're suffering either long COVID or long back injuries that they're not even recognizing that's what it is. It can be retina detachment. It can be your doctor telling you you have MS or psychological problems, whatever it is. But people who are searching can find independent resources now who are researching these questions and actually developing protocols that work and help people who've been bedridden after these problems and nobody knows why. So keep looking, keep reading, keep searching, and there is hope and there are answers out there.
Well, one of those sources is you and your work, and you're part of this beautiful new decentralized shift away from top-down corporate media to independent investigative journalists. I love your work. Where can people find not only your book but all of the work that you do, which I think is part of this paradigm you're describing?
Well, please Follow the Science anywhere, order it, because this is all word of mouth, since the big companies that would normally do interviews with me about my books aren't going to do any. Thank you to BlazeTV for doing this. It's been a huge boost. I really appreciate it. I think this is one of my more important books in terms of useful information that people have. But also you can go to SharylAttkisson.com, click the Full Measure tab, and that's where to watch my TV show on Sundays, which feeds to 43 million households, might be ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, depending on where you live. It's also at fullmeasure.news. You can watch anytime. And I have a Substack. I try to cross-post most everything at SharylAttkisson.com because I'm trying to reach everybody in some way, like we all are. Aren't we all trying to branch out now?
Yeah, it's also good to have that place where people know they can go, and just in case somebody stifles your work or suppresses it or downright strikes it. We'll see how YouTube feels about this particular episode. It'll be interesting. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been
thanks for having me. I appreciate it a lot.
A lot of enlightenment. I'm going to go re-examine my priors after this conversation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.